Welcome back, motorized bike enthusiast. In today's episode of Living Room Mechanic, we're going to be rebuilding the Zeda Triple 40. The motor you see in front of you is the first motor placed on the Path Dragon, our original trail bike build quite a few years ago. It's got quite a few miles on it as well. It's been used and abused and is in some desperate need of tender love and care. We're going to completely break the motor down to its core components, both top and bottom end, give it a good old cleaning, and face a lot of real-world challenges that you generally won't have to face on a relatively new motor. It's also got a strange noise that popped up a few months ago, so it's been sitting for a while. We're going to see if we can find out what the cause of that was while we're at it. Sit back and enjoy the video. Although this video will pretty much cover every step I take in the disassembly process, cleaning, replacing parts, and reassembling process, it's not really to be treated as a guide, as this is just my experience with this one particular motor in my given situation. I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert. I've only done this 3 times, including the video you're watching now. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, I do hope that you can grab some relevant and useful information from this video if you find yourself in a similar situation. Now, the main focus for this video is on the motor itself, so we're just going to skim over the carburetor real quick, as I actually have a dedicated video planned on these carburetors, not just cleaning and maintenance, but some tips and hacks that I haven't seen anybody else mention in any other videos. A bit of information that I think you guys might find useful. Look forward to that coming soon on the channel. Now let's get on to the more exciting part. Digging into the motor, starting with the exhaust, a small tip for you guys when removing the muffler. Put a little WD-40 on the stud. After you break the nut free, you can roll it off with your fingers so you don't have to sit there all day with a wrench getting the nut to the end of the stud. Once we crack this motor open, the handling of the parts will actually start cleaning it off for us. But since I don't want a lot of this debris getting inside what might still be good bearings, we're going to go ahead and wipe some of it off now, as we don't know what to expect once we open this motor. No need to make things worse. So we are in for a nasty little surprise once we get this jug off. I've actually never taken the head off of this motor, let alone the entire cylinder. The only parts I've actually replaced on this motor are the clutch assembly and the clutch bearings. You guys might have been around to remember back when we nuked the clutch on a trail. About 15 miles away from the house. Yeah, we somehow made it home on that motor, but man, it was making like the worst noise I'd ever heard, as the little bearings for the clutch assembly were just getting chewed up by the, by the gears.
That ain't good.
I see ball bearings underneath the clutch plate. Those ball bearings are certainly not supposed to be there. Oh, these are just falling everywhere.
Now as we take this head off, you're going to notice quite a bit of carbon buildup. As you guys know, I tend to run my trail bikes on the rich side. However, back in the day, I was probably overdoing it with a little too much on the rich side. I wouldn't say this is anything to be totally alarmed about, but it's definitely an unnecessary amount of carbon buildup. The plug's not looking too great either. We're going to replace that. A little bit of moisture buildup on the tip of the plug and around the edge of the cylinder. This motor had been sitting under the house, uncovered but not in direct contact with rain, so I'm still very curious how this moisture got in there. Maybe it's just condensation. Living here in the south, everything's like a public bathroom. It's just always wet. So when we pull the cylinder, you will notice that about half of the chrome lining is just gone. I never ported this motor. Like I said, never even opened it up, so this did it on its own. That's unfortunate. Like I said, we did push this motor pretty darn hard for a few years, so I won't say I'm totally surprised, but I'll definitely say I was not expecting this, let alone to be so severe. I guess once a little bit of it starts to go, it's kind of like a domino effect, and it just starts peeling itself away like a banana. So, as expected, the piston looks equally terrible, with gouging pretty much along the entire piston. We'll be replacing the cylinder, piston, and rings, of course. The clips looked fine. They weren't missing any ears, so they're not the cause of our issue. The needle bearing and wrist pin look fine to me. We'll reuse the needle bearing and the wrist pin, but we'll replace the clips with an upgraded version, or in my opinion, just a better ones with a single ear. They're a little more tricky to put in and take out, but they just tend to hold in the grooves better. Usually. We actually ran into an issue with that, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. There might be an issue with the new cylinder we're going to put on this motor. It's not technically new. I would say it's refurbished. Anyways, it wasn't a perfect match, but we will also cross that bridge once we get there. So, let's go ahead and pull these covers off to give them a quick clean and examination. The good news is, I think I have found what was causing the strange noise. The noise I thought was a bad bearing. Turns out that the sprocket had come loose, and this nut was on the verge of just falling out of the motor. Now, given the fact that I had replaced the entire clutch assembly in the past, not too long before this noise popped up, you would think that I would have re-examined my work as soon as the noise popped up. But I've never once claimed to be intelligent, so we just work with what we got. Anyways, I'm absolutely certain that this sprocket rattling around inside the motor was what was causing the noise. As evident, shown in the covers, quite a bit of gouging around the casing. It's a good thing we stopped running the motor when we did, because I'm sure that this would have nuked the case had I kept riding it. I would have also lost the nut, which would just have been a nuisance, but yeah, obviously not the most dramatic problem we would have had to deal with. Moving right along, you'll find the impact driver can be a blessing and a curse, but mostly a blessing, so don't worry about it. It's good to have one. We're going to go ahead and remove the magnet first, and I've noticed, I'm sure you have too, that once you remove this nut for the magnet itself actually has a little bit of wiggle room, and I've often wondered if you can use this to kind of fine-tune your timing. Maybe advance it just a hair or retard it a little bit to impact low-end torque or top-end speed. I really don't know, but I will definitely be testing this on a bike in the future, doing some top speed runs and then moving the magnet and seeing if it affects anything to a noticeable extent. Alright, let's move on. Now we attempt to remove the bevel gear. The dreaded bevel gear, especially on a motor that's been used and used a lot. It can downright be terrifying. And, of course, in our situation it was, because the worst case scenario happened. Not only did we strip it out, we nuked our heavy-duty impact flathead. So that sucks. We're going to have to deal with this, but we'll deal with it later in the video. Alright, now we are going to remove the entire clutch plate assembly. This is easier to do while it's still on the motor, but it's not impossible to do when it's off the motor, so don't worry about it. I like to remove it when it's on the motor because it makes removing the clutch bearings a little bit easier, or a lot easier. I can't remember, I just know it's easier. Anyways, a very, very important tip: if you're using the gear puller that came with the kit, it might just be any gear puller whatsoever on these cheap parts, you need to first clean the threads with parts cleaner. Use some brake parts cleaner, spray it on the threads of the engine part, and clean them. Then you need to use some WD-40 on the threads. You need to make sure that the puller is screwed into the part as far as it will go, even if that means using a pair of pliers to get just a few extra turns down into the clutch plate or sprocket gear, or whatever part you just so happen to be replacing, because if you strip out these threads, you are pretty much screwed. The puller will no longer be useful, and you might strip out the threads on the part itself, which is just going to make your day so much worse. So yeah, clean the threads, use WD-40, make sure you screw the puller in as far as it will go, then remove the part. Now, it's important that you know I do not, nor do I recommend you do, immediately jump to the impact driver when removing parts from the motor. I first try it with hand tools before moving to the impact driver. And when something won't remove with a hand tool, the impact driver brings in the curse, with stripping things out. Not always, just usually. Of course, this case screw decided it wasn't going anywhere. Of course, I never use an impact driver when reassembling the motor, but I had never taken this motor apart before, so this is all factory plus years of whatever keeps a screw in place. And of course, we stripped this one out, so we're going to have to deal with that one as well. This is turning into a fun adventure, isn't it? As long as you accept the limitations, you don't technically have to remove the bevel gear to split the case. It's recommended because if that seal and or that bearing is bad, you're kind of screwed. You have to remove the bevel gear. And if you're doing port work to match the case, then you'll need to make sure that you carefully cover up that bearing, because once you get metal shavings in the main bearings of the case, they're a pain to clean out. Plus, it's also really hard to check and see if that bearing's good. Anyways, in short, you don't technically have to remove the bevel gear, but you do have to remove this screw. And luckily for you guys, I have an entire video on how I remove snapped off motor mount studs, which I have linked in the description of this video. I used that exact same technique to remove this screw. It was actually pretty easy. I did have to drill a little deeper and use a larger easy out because this screw was torqued in from the factory. So there was that, but it's the same technique. I do remove the bevel gear from this case using that technique as well. Now with that, I had to drill even deeper and wider and use a giant easy out because that son of a gun was torqued in really good. Long story short, we got both of these out. Here's the link. Enjoy. Moving to the next section of the video. In one of our previous videos, when we took apart the YD100, I had recommended that you guys watch the video on the Zeda Motorsports YouTube channel for how to take apart a motorized bike motor. Link in the description. Combining that video with this video should give you pretty much everything you need to know, whether you're taking apart a new motor, which they did, or a used motor, which I'm doing. Their technique is what I use. And I like to watch that video before I take apart a motor because I don't do this very often. My memory sucks and I always need a refresher. So it's a good idea. If you think you know everything, you probably forgot something. And for splitting the case, I just use a very heavy hammer. I reinsert the nuts onto the edge of the shaft so I don't damage the thread. I don't apply any additional force. I just let the hammer fall on the shaft to split the case. Now, I'm doing a little different because I haven't yet removed the bevel gear, which I will be doing here in a moment. So there's that. With the case split and the important bits set aside, this bearing checks out okay. We're going to replace all the bearings anyways, but it's good to know we can keep this one as a backup. However, I noticed a lot of gunk inside the case. It looks like this might be blow-by combined with metal shavings that have just gunked up in there. Metal shavings from the cylinder and or the piston. Anyways, it's not supposed to look like that. It's supposed to be pretty clean, just oily. Note to self, if you're going to torque these down, don't use Loctite. If you're going to use Loctite, don't torque these down. Just don't do both. Big shout out to Black & Decker for a set of easy outs that so far hasn't snapped on me. So, same as before, clean these threads with parts cleaner. Spray them with WD-40, ensure that the puller is screwed all the way in, and then remove the gear. if the loose sprocket wasn't the cause of our noise, this bearing certainly could have been. It's toast. And you'll notice this side of the case is particularly more cruddy than the other. A black goop, which, like I said, I assume is just fine aluminum shavings mixed with oil. Or blow-by carbon. Really hard to tell. But we got to replace that bearing, so let's get to it. There, got you. So, if it's a bad bearing, or one you just don't care about, grab a socket, a hammer, and beat on it until it breaks free. However, if it's a good bearing, then grab the largest socket you can fit in the case, make sure the flat side is against the bearing, and hit it with a mallet. Rubber mallet. Good, strong, sharp hits. Try and knock them free. Usually you won't damage the bearing, at least in my experience, and you'll be free to use it again, or at least have it as a backup if you plan on replacing them, as I'm going to put all new bearings in this case. When it comes to removing the seals, I just grab a flathead and very gently pry up on the seal until it pops loose. And be careful, because these can go flying. I found that these seals are usually bad from the factory, as they tend to just cram them into the motor without using any kind of lubrication. As you can see, this one's peeled up on the edge, and it's on the edge going into the motor, so I know it's not from my screwdriver. I found that on these motors there's two different size seals, but for different motors. On my YD100 it uses these thicker seals on both sides of the case, but on this PK80 and all the other ones I've taken apart, they use two different size seals. There's a thinner one on the magnet side and this thicker one on the clutch side, so keep that in mind if you're purchasing seals for one side of your case. There's one.
There's too much fluffies on this one for this.
Got him! So here's where things get a little iffy. This is a repurposed cylinder from the Sutek PK80. It's the original cylinder. We replaced the cylinder on that motor not because this one was bad, but because I wanted to port match this one, take my time and make it nice, but I still needed to use that motor, so we just threw a fresh new cylinder on it and took this one off and did the work. And everything checks out with the cylinder. It's ported, polished, all that good fun stuff. Debate whether or not polishing is really necessary aside, we ran into an issue matching it to the case. Turns out the cylinder case matching is out of the question. It's just not a good match. I'd have to remove way too much material from the case to get anywhere near a good match. So instead we're just going to remove a little bit of material and try and bevel the edges just a little bit, but it's not going to be a very good match. We're not looking to gain any performance with this porting. I'm just doing it to increase airflow a little bit, because otherwise it'd be way too restrictive. Now when it comes to seating the bearings, this section is just my own thoughts and techniques. This may or may not be a good way to do it. From what I understand is the bearings need to have a pretty snug fit. In case a bearing was to fail, it wouldn't spin in the case. It wouldn't spin the entire unit, which would cause severe damage to the case. Now with these cheap $26 cases, which is what they run for, not really a big deal. But if it's a motor that you put a lot of work and time into, you don't want a bad bearing to destroy the case. That's why they're pretty snug, I think. Anyways, sometimes, because these aren't machined very well, the bearing will go in fine, require a bit of force, but that's normal. However, on this particular side of the case, this bearing did not want to go in very well at all. So I took a bit of sandpaper and removed just a hair of material and added some WD-40, and I was able to get it to seat in with about the same amount of pressure as I did on the other side. So that's just a technique I use, which may or may not be a good thing, to get these bearings to seat in these ill-machined cases. As far as I can tell from the information I've gathered and reading the numbers on these bearings, both the clutch and the crank use a 6202 bearing. The clutch will tend to use a shielded or a double sealed bearing, whereas the crank will use a sealed one-sided bearing. they're identical. I just removed the seal from the inner portion of this bearing so it receives lubrication from the fuel and oil mix. For these seals, I've tried taking them to various auto parts stores so that they could cross-reference the numbers into something that would hopefully be in stock, or at the very least, something they could ship to a local store. I've been unlucky in my endeavors. If you've happened to find some information that's made these obtainable locally, please let me know in the comments, otherwise I'm just stuck buying them online. So this is the bad seal that I'm going to replace. Now for seating these, I apply a pretty liberal amount of grease to the inner and outer side of the seal, and then I use a large socket so that I can seat them flush with the case. I might push them down just a little bit so that they don't stand proud, but I want to make sure that they're not rubbing against the bearings directly. I'm not sure if this would cause an issue. I don't think so because of the lubrication inside the motor, but I'm just not sure, so I make sure that they're at least flush but not touching the bearings. Something I forgot to mention when I was taking apart the case and removing the crank. Now I did remember to pay attention to this because it's easy to forget. However, I don't think it's going to matter in my case because of an issue I ran into while trying to put the case back together. These cranks usually have shims on them, and it's different for just about every motor, as every one I've taken apart has had a different amount and in different places. In this particular motor, there were 2 shims on one side and 3 on the other. Unfortunately, when I went to put the case back together, it would not close. I had to remove all 5 shims to get the case to close. My fear is that maybe I didn't seat the bearings deep enough into the case, and that's going to be an issue in the future as they might loosen up and then the crank might start to wiggle around because it doesn't have the shims. Well, with me, I simply could not get the case to close without removing them, so I removed them. This might be an issue in the future. Hopefully it won't be. But I'm just telling you guys this because this is one of those real-world issues which you might run into. Let's hope for the best, but make sure you pay attention to how many shims you have and what side they're on. Hopefully in your case you'll be able to put them all back. It's amazing how a few spare parts in a Ziploc bag can remind you to add a certain bit of content to your video that could help a lot of people. Well, let's assume for a moment that once this crisis is all long behind us and the prices on these motors have restabilized at about the $100 to $120 price point for just the cheap basic motors, I want you to consider just buying an entire motor instead of buying a bunch of spare parts every time something breaks down. I bring this up because currently you see me taking these bolts out of a bag. These bolts are from an old bad motor. The motor had a bad piston, a bad cylinder, and a stripped out mounting stud hole, so rendering it pretty much useless and not worth rebuilding. However, I have gutted so many parts out of that motor to keep my other bikes running that it's just frankly been very convenient to have an extra motor on hand. In my situation, if I had an extra good motor and one of my motors went out on a bike, I would swap the motors and then use the bad motor for spare parts. Once you start buying a bunch of little parts for these motors, a piston, a cylinder, piston clips, nuts and bolts, mounting studs, just various bits and pieces like seals and bearings, these are all things that I've taken out of the bad motor and used in my running motors, which is what I'm doing right here. Putting these bolts from the old bad motor into this case because these ones were stripped out pretty bad and the other ones weren't. So just consider that. If you find a motor for a good price, even if it's just a cheap junky motor you don't really plan on using, the parts on it can definitely come in handy in a pinch because you pretty much have everything you need, at least one of them. A quick stop at the Magneto while we're reassembling this. I'm going to remove the white wire that I don't use for anything. If I did need to use it for anything, I could tap into the blue wire because they are both connected to the exact same spot. For placing the magnet and key back in position, I don't really have a trick for this. It's always a pain. Generally I just use a flathead screwdriver to kind of hold it in place as I wiggle the magnet back down onto the shaft, and after about a half dozen tries I usually get it. After the Magneto and the magnet are both in position, I'll loosen up the screws on the Magneto and use a piece of paper to shim it. The magnet can actually pull the bars from the Magneto onto it and cause them to rub against each other. You definitely don't want them to rub against each other because that's metal on metal. But as long as you can fit a piece of paper in between both sides, rotate the engine, test fit it again, you should be good to go. Now I realize the case gasket is kind of out of order here, as I placed it in obviously before I put the case together, but I made a mistake of cutting the bridge on top of the case gasket. Now see, there's a section of the gasket that you won't use because it would get in the way of the piston. I recommend leaving that in while you assemble the case because it holds the gasket together and it's just a lot easier to get everything in there without having to use 3 hands. When I trim the top of this gasket off, I make sure that I leave about 1 millimeter above the case. This ensures a seal because it's a T-seal. The gasket above it will be sealing against the gasket below, and if you cut it too shallow, you might end up with a leak right here. I place a razor flat on the case and then carefully shave away at the gasket, ensuring that a little bit is left protruding or proud. Of course, you could go to the auto parts store and buy some gasket paper. I've done that plenty of times and made my own gasket. I've also seen people use gasket maker. I don't know how well that holds up, but I'm sure it would work just fine as well. But you have to remember the case is pressurized. How pressurized is it? I don't really know. In every case that I've taken apart so far, there's always been one bearing that sticks to the clutch shaft. And this bearing can be a headache to deal with if it's bad. In my case, this one's a little gritty. I'm sure I could keep using it for many miles without an issue, but I just really want to go ahead and put all new bearings in this since I've gone through so much already. The trick I use to get this bearing off the shaft is just penetrating oil, in my case WD-40, and a flathead screwdriver. I work it around the bearing, just twisting it and prying at it until it breaks loose. That's pretty much all there is to it. If your clutch shaft is really rusted though, you might want to let this just sit in penetrating oil like PB Blaster for a couple hours, and that should help you break it free. Otherwise, you could slam it with a hammer. If it's a bad bearing, that might work. A tip I learned from watching the Zeda video on disassembling the case: during reassembly, I'm going to go ahead and tighten this spring up just about a half turn. So if you're having any issues with your clutch slipping because there's not enough tension on this spring, that'll help tighten it up a little bit, or so I'm told. It's actually my first time trying it, and we'll find out when we get it on a bike if it makes a difference. Anyways, for installing the clutch bearings, make sure you only install one side before you put the shaft in. If you get in a hurry and you forget to put the shaft in and you install both bearings, congratulations, you have to take the whole engine apart and knock out one of those bearings. So don't do that. Now, I'm pretty convinced that there's a better way to do what I'm doing here, but seating these bearings and making sure that the shaft is centered without being pushed too far up against one side can be a bit tricky in my experience, so I'm just going back and forth with a large socket making sure the bearing is seated all the way, and a small socket to knock the clutch shaft into position so that the keyways are exposed equally on both sides. If that didn't make any sense, I'm sorry. That's all I got. To kind of help push that topic home, as you can see here, after I've seated the bearings and the shaft, when I go to rotate the shaft, it's really tight. So I take a socket on one side, knock the shaft, test it to make sure it spins freely, and if not, then I'll move over to the other side and then knock the shaft again until it spins freely. And moving to the next section, a fun fact. Did you realize that these clutch plate assemblies actually grab the pads on both sides? Something I didn't realize for a long time, but the clutch plate that you're familiar with, the shiny one, is only half of the friction force on the pads. The other half is actually the plate behind the pads. The more you know. A lot of you might not have realized that, because I didn't realize it for a long time. So it's important when you're greasing the bevel gears to make sure that not only do you not get grease on the shiny side of the plate, but you don't get it behind the clutch pads either, because you'll lose half of your friction force. After ensuring this time that I added Loctite to the sprocket nut, I'll take a large pair of pliers, or a pipe wrench I think it's called, grab down on the studs for the clutch plate, and go ahead and tighten this. After slipping a few times and busting your knuckles, you'll eventually get it. And now that my neighbor is mowing his lawn, we'll get to listen to that during the video, but I am finishing this today and then going to bed. So, standard reassembly and basic maintenance here. Make sure that you grease the bucking bar and the bearing and anything else that rubs together for metal on metal, such as the camshaft for the clutch. So you may have noticed that we pretty much disassembled and are reassembling this entire motor off the bike. There are a few things that are easier to do on the bike, such as removing certain sprockets and messing with the clutch plate, but a technique I use for both disassembly and reassembly of the clutch plate to get it adjusted somewhere in the ballpark so that when we put it on the bike we won't have to open this case back up on the clutch side again, is I simply take the clutch bar, hold it in with my hand, and adjust the flower nut appropriately. You want the engagement point to be somewhere where the bar is parallel with the case of the motor, maybe slightly canted in towards the case. If that doesn't make any sense, you haven't been doing this for very long, but I don't fault you for not understanding. It's just kind of a do by feel and experience sort of technique. You'll get it, I promise. After cleaning an ungodly amount of grease out of this case during disassembly, I decided not to go quite as liberal as I usually do on greasing these gears, as any excess grease is just going to get flung off in this case and not make a world of difference as far as lubrication is concerned. Generally, a bit of grease around the entire large gear is going to do the trick. I also recommend removing any grease on top of the small bevel gear where it does not engage the large gear, because that can get flung onto your clutch plate, and that's bad for obvious reasons. So yeah, try and grease the large gear and not the small one. So the connecting rod has holes on the top and bottom so that the needle bearings for both the crank and the piston will receive oil. I'm adding some 3-in-1 to pre-lube the motor into these holes on the connecting rod. Now you can see me installing the piston, and this is a piston which I have skirted to match the cylinder. So at top dead center, the intake port is completely open and not obscured by the bottom of the piston. This adds a little bit of intake duration. I also think it advances the intake timing a little bit. I can't tell you what all this will do to your motor. All I know is I did it to the Sutec PK80, and that motor is running fantastic. It has a lot of torque and pretty good top end. Top speed 36 miles an hour with the stock 44.2 sprocket. So hopefully it'll make a difference on this motor. Who knows? But we did it anyways. When installing the wrist pin clips, I'm using aftermarket clips with the single ear. These particular clips are a little more malleable than the stock ones. The stock ones are kind of brittle. It's easy to break a wing off of those, or an ear, and if one breaks off in the motor while it's running, that's bad, very bad. So I can't really explain in the video how to do this properly. All I can tell you is I had to work with it a little bit to get these pins to seat completely into the grooves of the piston. Had to take them out a few times, bend them, put them back in until I got them to completely seat where there's no chance that the wrist pin will push the clips out of the grooves. While we're on the subject, it's very important to also make sure you install your piston correctly, where the two pins for the piston rings are facing the intake side of the motor and not the exhaust. Most of you already know what happens if you reverse the piston, but we'll just say it's bad for anybody who might be here for the first time. Since these are new piston rings, I would like to thank Zeda Motorsports' YouTube channel for sharing this tip with us, which might save cylinders for a lot of viewers. I'm taking some sandpaper, I think this is 320 grit, and I am lightly sanding the corners of the rings. I suppose this is to help prevent them from catching on corners of the ports and prevent them from peeling away at the chrome lining. After wiping any sand residue off of the piston rings, we'll go ahead, oil the piston, and then carefully add our base gasket for the cylinder. When doing this, you want to make sure you don't tear any portions of this gasket on the threads of the studs. If you get a little tear on the inner portion next to the studs, what can happen is you'll think that it's sealed, but gases will actually escape up through the cylinder past the stud. If you feel any gases escaping around one of your studs, you'll know that you've got a torn base gasket. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and test fit the cylinder now to ensure that at top dead center we won't have any clearance issues with the piston hitting the head. And as far as I can tell, everything looks good. Ooh, shiny. Due to our mismatching cylinder to case, I'm going to make my own gasket. This is simple gasket paper that's fuel and oil resistant, which I purchased at AutoZone. You can get it in a roll pretty cheap. I take a square, and then I take a hammer, and I press down on the, I guess just say the skirt of the cylinder, so that I get a circle formed out. And this is really the only part you need to do. After you get this lined out, you can cut it with a razor, put it on the cylinder, and then cut out the transfer ports with a razor. By the way, shout out to Two Stroke Stuffing's YouTube channel for that last tip on how to make a gasket for these cylinders. As far as punching out a hole in the gasket for the studs, I'm sure there's a much better way to do this, but I'm just using a Phillips head screwdriver to carefully punch a hole for the studs. Here I'm adding the head gasket, which is just a basic cheap aluminum one. In the future, I'm going to start using the brass ones, maybe even the copper ones, which I think are better. But the thing is with these cheap aluminum head gaskets, as I notice after they're smashed into position, some of them tend to protrude into the cylinder, which can cause them to get caught by the piston rings and possibly break off a bit of aluminum, which can definitely cause some issues inside the motor. So if you're using one of these gaskets, after you smash them into position, you might want to take the head back off and shave off any of the material that protrudes into the cylinder so that you don't have issues with them. I'm going to go ahead and swap out cylinder heads here. The shiny one is one that's been reconditioned from an old motor. It doesn't have any damage on it. The one on the Zeda should work just fine. I don't see any issues with it, but it looks like there was definitely some debris that got into the cylinder and smashed between the piston and the head, as I can see some gouges in the top of the head. Might recondition this one to have it as a backup, but for now we're just going to go ahead and use the clean one. We're going to go ahead and pop in an NGK plug here. We're going to use a B8HS. It's a little bit colder than I'd like to use. I just have a surplus of these because my YD100 liked to eat spark plugs before I got the tune right, and I need to use some of these up. Ideally, I would probably use a B6HS, a bit of a hotter plug, because these motors don't generally suffer from overheating in my situation, my style of riding, but I'm not a expert on plugs and what heat you should use in these motors. This is just what I have, so it's what I'm going to use. So this cylinder is a 32 millimeter intake, and that's something you need to keep an eye on when purchasing cylinders. If you're getting a top-end replacement kit that does not come with an intake manifold, make sure that it matches the one you have, or you purchase one that'll match the kit. I have a bunch of 40 millimeter intakes because, well, The Zeda Triple 40 originally came with a 40mm intake, so that's one of its selling points, and the YD100 did. I guess some other motor I had did, but we still have a 32 here that I bored out best I could, but it's definitely not going to match the cylinder, so the airflow won't be ideal. It's what we got, and it's going to work. Going to have to make a gasket for it though. Rebuilt, back together, and all cleaned up. She is ready to go on a bike. Ran out of time this week, but I promise in the next video we'll have her up and running. We might run into some issues, but who knows? I've been pretty lucky getting these back together to start right up. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, ride safe.